Have you ever felt that unexpected urge, almost as if something deeper wanted to take over your thoughts? It's intriguing to imagine that, in the midst of so many voices, there is one that whispers directly to our hearts, awakening sensations that we don't always know how to explain. Sometimes, an inexplicable tranquility or a restlessness that doesn't quiet down emerges, and this presence might be trying to reveal something powerful about the path we should follow. Write the word "listen" in the comments. Do this without hesitation. This act is not trivial, as each typed word can represent your desire to receive a voice that illuminates doubts and inspires courage. When you join this movement, you commit to closely observing the ways in which God communicates, even amidst the hustle and bustle of daily life. It is within this harmony that the transformation that so many seek and few truly embrace resides. Stay here. There are 25 signs that can shed light on how God speaks to your mind, and each one carries a force that can push you to see what was previously unnoticed. These signs come from sacred passages and touch upon everyday situations. By discovering each detail, you will place yourself in front of answers that may come as comfort or as a challenge. And in the end, there is a sign that tends to change perspectives and bring calm to the disturbances that insist on surrounding the heart. Now, be participative. Leave your like, subscribe, and activate the bell. With this attitude, you help spread something that can ignite faith and hope in many. Have you noticed how many people need a message that makes them regain their courage? You can be the bridge that connects those who need a dose of encouragement with the certainty that there is a greater purpose in every obstacle. I invite you to reflect. What is God trying to show you today? Often, the answer might be closer than you imagine. Perhaps by sharing your experience in the comments, insights may arise that illuminate areas of life that seemed confusing. Stay until the end, for there is something reserved that usually warms the soul of those who receive it with open arms. So, do you want me to finish? Have you ever felt that restlessness that arises without asking permission, almost as if something inside you screamed to rethink a choice? That inner voice, which some try to ignore, may very well be a sign that God is insisting on being present. When Romans 2:14-15 speaks that even those who do not have direct contact with the Scriptures end up following divine principles, this makes it clear that, deep down, we carry a moral compass capable of pointing the right path, even when we stubbornly ignore it. It is uncomfortable to think that this conscience acts as a reminder that God is not absent, even when life seems like a labyrinth. When you falter before important decisions, there is a weight that makes you hesitate. It's not mere guilt. It's not just a fear of making mistakes. It's God using your sensitivity to reinforce that there is a limit, a boundary that should not be crossed. It is at this point that valuable lessons are hidden. Observe yourself better. When faced with something that seems advantageous but carries that silent discomfort, do not underestimate that voice. Stop. Recognize that it may be your chance to give space to the direction that God wants to show. Seek discernment in prayer and ask for clarity. This brief moment of reflection is not a waste of time. It is when you find peace amidst uncertainties. If this has ever happened to you, share it. Tell us in the comments how your conscience led you to a different choice. Perhaps a path that regained your tranquility when everything seemed hopeless. And remember, every testimony can spark hope in those who are struggling with the same conflicts. Now, before moving on to the next step and discovering how God can tap into your creativity to produce unexpected solutions, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on where you're watching from. These gestures can reach people who need exactly this message today. Have you ever noticed how certain memories suddenly arise, bringing a mix of longing, regret, or hope? Sometimes a simple event is enough for this inner whirlwind to find a voice. In those moments, the conscience presents itself as a messenger that does not want to be ignored, poking at dormant areas and pointing out what needs to be reevaluated. It's not just something subjective, it's a call that shakes our routine and highlights what was previously unnoticed. There may be times when you wonder why certain decisions that seemed safe start to weigh heavily. This discomfort doesn't arise by chance. It's as if God touches our innermost being to remind us that there are consequences and responsibilities that cannot be sidelined. When we ignore this voice, difficulties usually become more pronounced, as if a part of us insists on being heard. On the other hand, following this inner guidance often brings a different kind of peace, almost a relief that defies logical explanations. This doesn't mean that the problems disappear like magic, but rather that you gain a sense of coherence and firmness. If at any moment you looked back and noticed that a particular choice spared you from greater suffering, it was probably your conscience playing its role. It is essential to observe that God is not limited to spectacular signs or unquestionable mystical experiences. Often he acts precisely where no one expects, within seemingly ordinary thoughts. By paying attention to this subtle alert, you open a door to insights that can change the course of situations that have been troubling you. Sharing these experiences has powerful value. When you share in the comments the day your conscience saved you from an unconsidered decision, other people may find the courage to better listen to the voices that have been throbbing in their own hearts. So do not hesitate to talk about it. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on where you are following us from. These steps, as simple as they may seem, create connections that can transform many paths. And of course, stay tuned for what is coming next. In the next sign, you will see how God can use your own creativity to inspire unexpected paths and solutions that seemed unattainable. Each step you take in this direction reveals a new layer of divine care. There are moments when it seems like our mind goes out of control and presents ideas that change everything. That solution that comes at the right time, through a path you would never dare to imagine. It is possible that you question whether this is just luck or chance. But when James 3:17 talks about the wisdom that comes from above, pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere, it reveals that sometimes what you call a brilliant idea might be much more than you imagine. It doesn't mean that everything will happen without effort. There are struggles, uncertainties, and unforeseen events that test our resilience. But suddenly, a different inspiration emerges, something that makes your heart beat faster. Maybe it's that flash that points to an unusual way out, almost as if someone were whispering new possibilities. It is in these fragments of courage that one perceives God blowing creativity into those who are tired of insisting on empty solutions. The curious thing is that these solutions don't always appear in a grandiose manner. They can spring up in the silence of the early morning, in a simple moment when you allow yourself to listen to what has been bubbling in your mind. You realize that you don't need to have all the answers ready, but rather the willingness to embrace a glimpse of something greater. Thus, problems that seem directionless gain direction, and instead of frustration, you discover strategies that illuminate the path. Divine inspiration doesn't ask for formal permissions. It arrives straightforwardly, nudging the intimate and overturning worries that seemed unsolvable. It's as if God wanted to remind you that He knows your needs even before you express them. But there is a requirement to feel this impact. You need to allow yourself to believe that there is something beyond mere chance. It doesn't matter the size of the obstacle or how dark the road is. What matters is the openness to receive an insight that can change everything. When you experience this spark, you understand that God does not abandon those who feel pressured by difficulties. If there is a lack of clarity, He sends an idea that escapes logic. If there is little strength left, he brings a breath of vitality that reanimates. If fear settles in, he presents such an unusual way out that you feel compelled to take a risk. In the end, these inspirations act as confirmations that God does not get distracted by your dilemmas, but continues to guide you to a level that goes beyond what the eyes can see. Reflect on a situation where everything seemed unfeasible, and suddenly a new path emerged before you. There was probably a mix of astonishment and relief, almost as if something inside you said, "Trust." If this has ever happened to you, share it. Tell us in the comments how this creativity changed your perspective, and in doing so, encourage those who need a little more courage to believe in divine action. Stay tuned here. In the next stage, we will explore how God warns us about dangers we often ignore, sending signals that can literally redefine our steps. Don't leave without first leaving your like, subscribing to the channel, and commenting on where you follow this content from. Have you noticed how certain ideas appear just when everything seems to be falling apart? It's that moment when, without warning, such unexpected thoughts come that they take your breath away. This is not merely a coincidence. It might be God acting with a precision that at first glance escapes our understanding. He casts light where there is confusion, pointing to paths we hadn't even considered. And when we make space for this inspiration, the barriers that were suffocating us begin to dissipate. Sometimes you can feel an almost palpable discomfort, as if you were facing an unsolvable puzzle. This state of restlessness is not useless. It is the perfect ground for new angles and approaches to arise. God acts precisely at these critical points, relieving the burden and showing that you do not have to go through it all alone. In some cases, the solution can be something simple, like reorganizing priorities. In others, it can be so grand that it subverts your entire way of looking at the world. If you've ever found yourself doubting, thinking these ideas fell from the sky, consider that maybe it's just that, a divine provision at the exact moment when your heart was open to receive. When we stop to pray or even to meditate in silence, something within us inclines to listen. And God, who does not ignore our afflictions, finds gaps to plant whispers full of clarity and truth. Do not imagine that this process is a magic formula. Often the mind needs to rid itself of fears and distractions that cover up creativity. But when you allow yourself to pay attention to this different breath, it is remarkable how the impossible starts to seem less frightening. Sometimes all that was needed was to see the same situation from another perspective, and then that idea that seemed impossible becomes concrete and tangible. Seek this connection. Every time you find yourself cornered by problems, ask the Father for discernment. He does not keep his distance. On the contrary, he places in your thoughts suggestions that, if followed, can change the course of any crisis. Maybe you need a small insight to resolve pending issues that keep you up at night. Or perhaps a big turnaround that will completely transform your plans. In both cases, God is ready to collaborate as long as you open yourself to this discreet but powerful intervention. Share in the comments if you have ever experienced something like this. Tell us where you are following along from, and leave your like so others can also find this source of hope. Never underestimate the power of a mind guided from above, for it is at the crossroads of life that creativity sent by God becomes more urgent and, at the same time, more transformative. Have you ever noticed that sudden discomfort that arises amid so many distractions, almost as if something inside you is screaming to stop what you're doing? Sometimes it happens early in the morning when you wake up with a strange feeling that you should check something before leaving. At other times it appears in the middle of a conversation, urging you to think twice before agreeing to a proposal that on the surface seems tempting. This impulse, which some call intuition, could very well be God nudging your mind to spare you from paths filled with painful consequences. When 2 Chronicles 15 shows the Spirit of God speaking through Azariah, it becomes evident that the Creator is not content to remain silent. He manifests in the quieter corners of our consciousness, offering warnings that can make the difference between tranquility and regret. The discomfort you feel inside is not always a product of fear or insecurity. Often it is divine care, making your heart see details that the eyes ignore. Perhaps you have already been seized by an unshakable certainty that something was out of place. This sudden desire to stop what you're doing may seem inconvenient, but in a split second, life changes course. Imagine that you have your car ready for a trip and suddenly you feel a pressure to check the oil or the brakes. By doing so, you discover a serious problem that could have resulted in an accident later on. At that moment, the supposed delay becomes a deliverance. Don't let yourself be driven by the rush that the world imposes. If your mind keeps echoing a warning, don't pretend you didn't hear it. It is possible that God is showing you safer paths, or perhaps preventing you from getting involved in situations that would cause you to suffer. He knows every detail of your day, knows where you step, and understands the traps that sometimes aren't even visible. When you feel this signal, do not discard it. Take a deep breath, pray silently, and allow this feeling to mature before acting. If the discomfort persists, evaluate everything calmly. Do not close yourself off to advice and guidance that may come from people who care about you, because God also uses relationships to reinforce His warnings. And if by chance relief comes after making a more cautious decision, do not forget to be thankful for this care. Some prefer to call it a sixth sense. Others describe it as an inevitable premonition. The label does not matter as much as the willingness to listen and heed. When this call arises, there is a reason beyond our logic. God does not want you to advance blindly down dark roads. He wants to spare you unnecessary pain and guide your steps along more reliable paths. Now think, has this inner voice ever stopped you from making a grave mistake, saving you from complications that, at the time, didn't even seem possible? If so, share in the comments. Your story may encourage someone who finds themselves in the same dilemma, needing confirmation not to ignore a warning that weighs on their heart. Stay alert, as there are more signs that reveal how God acts carefully, almost imperceptibly, in situations that escape our radar. Do not miss the next topic, which could illuminate your journey even more. Have you ever experienced that sudden clarity that arises amid so many uncertainties, almost as if someone opened a window in a dark room and let the light in? This kind of revelation can be a powerful reminder that God is present, wanting you to go beyond the surface and discover who He really is. In Ephesians 1:17, Paul implores us to receive a spirit of wisdom and revelation, something that makes us understand what was previously unseen, igniting an inner flame capable of dispelling doubt. When you find yourself in prayer or meditating on the Word, sometimes you feel an impulse that realigns previously confused thoughts, transforming indecision into clear direction. These flashes do not come out of nowhere. They are traces of God's care, signaling that He wants a close relationship, not just to point out shortcuts to immediate problems. It's an invitation to delve into a deeper level of intimacy, where you begin to see details that previously escaped your eyes. And then comes the point where the desires of your heart change color. That longing that once seemed just yours starts to pulse in harmony with the divine purpose, almost as if someone had tuned the strings of an out-of-tune instrument. Psalm 37:4 highlights that when you delight in the Lord, He aligns your desires with what brings fulfillment. It's not just "I want this," but rather, "I want what God wants for me." 1. This state of surrender opens doors that were locked because God does not throw words to the wind. He plants convictions full of meaning. And when your strength wanes and discouragement threatens to take over, a stimulus emerges that rescues courage. It's as if God breathes new energy, reminding you that He did not give a spirit of timidity, but of power and balance. Suddenly, that feeling of exhaustion finds a respite that cannot be explained with common reasoning. You resume your walk and realize that even in your weaknesses, there is an invisible assistance pointing each step. Yes, you might even think that all of this is just coincidences. But deep down, you know that there is something greater coordinating every detail. That feeling of clarity that arises amidst uncertainty, the motivation that is reborn when your strength seems exhausted, the persistence of a desire that does not let you rest until it is heard. Everything points to a silent but powerful voice that insists on guiding the heart and stirring the deepest convictions. You wondered whether you would follow or ignore it, and you realized that in fact, not following would be much more complicated than yielding to a calling that gives no respite. Well then, what comes next might further expand your perception, because God is not limited to the signs that have already been mentioned. There are other ways through which He communicates, and in each of them there is an invitation to an experience different from the one you have been living. It is not about following fixed rules or rigid methods, but about realizing that there are subtle movements that we do not always value. 6 signs were left behind, but now you will see other aspects of how this divine voice manifests. Sign 7. Verses that emerge at the exact moment. You know that Bible phrase that, out of nowhere, comes to mind when you least expect it? Or even that passage of Scripture that jumps in front of your eyes as if someone wanted to catch your attention. It can happen the moment you open the Bible almost randomly, or when, scrolling through your social media feed, you come across a passage that describes your current dilemma. It is not mere chance. There are occasions when, upon reading these lines, your inner self turns as if an undeniable truth is being spoken directly to your situation. How many times have you noticed that certain passages seem to come to life precisely when everything is turbulent? They calm, instruct, and show a different route. Romans 8:28, for example, might arrive as an unexpected relief. All things work together for good, pushing you to trust even when the obstacles are many. Or it could be Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me, reminding you of strengths you didn't know you had, ready to be activated. The point is, these verses, at the exact moment, speak of a synchronization that cannot be explained by logic alone. For this to become more real, it is essential to keep your sensitivity heightened. You open yourself to the possibility that God uses the Word to bring the answers you need. And when you perceive this alignment, the effect tends to be transformative. It's as if He is saying, I know exactly what you are going through. Usually, the reaction is not superficial euphoria, but a serene conviction that someone is watching your steps, ready to give support. Sign 8. Dreams and visions that disturb or comfort. It may seem bold to imagine that God still uses dreams or sudden images to speak, but the truth is that, in various biblical episodes, He sent messages through dreams, and it is not a phenomenon confined to ancient accounts. You may have moments when, while sleeping, you see intense scenes that bring warning, comfort, or instructions. Or while awake, a mental image suddenly appears that makes your heart race. Not every dream has a deep meaning, but when something stays alive in your mind upon waking, bringing a feeling of urgency or serenity, it is wise not to dismiss it. You can pray, asking for discernment to understand if there is a message there. There are reports of people who have changed travel routes, love decisions, or even professional strategies after an insistent dream pointed to something unnoticed. The point is, stay alert. God can use the language of the unconscious to prod issues that consciously you have been ignoring. Certain dreams bring instant peace, as if they were hugs that confirm that God is still in control. Others generate discomfort, almost an alert not to move forward without analyzing the consequences. The wisest thing is not to disregard the possibility that these dreams are a communication channel. Perhaps it is God's way of sending an urgent message, leading you to see what is obscured by the daily rush. Sign 9. Circumstances that fit unexpectedly. Imagine that suddenly doors open before you, proposals that seemed unattainable arise at the exact moment. Or conversely, you stumble upon so many barriers that you question whether it is really to continue in that direction. Sometimes these scenarios are not mere coincidences. They could be God facilitating or blocking paths to guide you to a safe place. Yes, not everything that seems impossible is a sign to give up, and not everything that flows effortlessly is a sign of divine approval. But there are moments when circumstances align in such a peculiar way that you feel compelled to recognize an invisible hand guiding everything. One day you feel the desire to return to study, and surprisingly, a vacancy or a scholarship arises. Another day, you consider accepting a job, and mysteriously discover something that sheds light on the work environment, showing that it would not be the best choice. The key here is to keep your eyes open and your heart willing to see what goes beyond common logic. If suddenly the doors close categorically, question whether it is God Himself wanting to redirect you. And if the doors open without major stumbling blocks, also question whether it is Him giving a green light to proceed. Amidst this, internal serenity is often a faithful thermometer. Sign 10. People who appear with timely words. It is intriguing how, on some days, we find someone who brings a message so accurate that if it were planned, it wouldn't be so perfect. It could be a friend, a family member, or even a stranger who, without having any idea of what is happening in your life, says a phrase that hits the mark. This type of coincidence often makes us think, how did this person know what I was going through? The truth is that many times God uses people around us to reveal something essential. Some of these people aren't even aware that they are carrying a message. They just say what they feel they need to say, and that finds a deep echo in you. Somehow these encounters can bring encouragement, comfort, or even a reprimand that makes you reassess your actions. Maybe you remember a moment when you were about to make a complicated decision and someone came with advice that changed everything from a different perspective. Do not underestimate this type of event. It is possible that you prayed or cried out for guidance, and God sent this individual with the answer. It's not to idolize people, but to recognize that they can be divine instruments in times of uncertainty. Sign 11. Songs that touch the heart. Some people get easily emotional when they listen to specific lyrics. It's not about liking or not liking a certain musical style. It's about feeling that that particular song, at that moment, seems to describe exactly what you are experiencing, bringing direction or hope. You might be distracted when suddenly you hear a song that talks about surrender, trust, or overcoming, and something inside of you stirs, almost like an awakening. These melodies can act as bridges between heaven and earth because the words and musical arrangement can penetrate places where logical reasoning does not reach. If God can use a person's direct speech, why not also use songs to ignite flames that were almost extinguished? Some of these songs even include excerpts from the Bible itself or are inspired by spiritual events. So when you realize it, you feel that the phrase is not mere poetry, but a truth that solves your inner confusion. Of course, decisions should not be based solely on the feelings generated by a song, but if something fits coherently with other signs, Why not pay attention? Music can be a powerful vehicle for God to reinforce something he has already been whispering. Sign 12. Silence that speaks louder than noise. Have you noticed how at certain moments everything becomes quiet and, in the absence of distractions, something begins to pulse inside of you? It seems paradoxical to say that God speaks in silence, but that happens constantly. When you retreat, turn off social media for a few moments, and silence the external voices, you can start to hear the inner voice more clearly. This silence doesn't need to be a formal spiritual retreat or a prolonged escape. Sometimes it's just a moment at the end of the day when the rush gives way to a minute of pause. The mind calms down, and in this refuge, ideas surface, feelings organize, and if you are open, you may perceive directions that didn't seem to exist. Don't underestimate this interval. Many realize that in this quietude, God finds gaps to promote internal alignments that daily turbulences suffocate. Sign 13. An uncontainable feeling of compassion. There is that moment when you are moved by someone or a cause to the point that you can't pretend that nothing is happening. A voluntary action arises, or an insistent desire to help hits your chest. Usually, the motivation is not just a good intention. There is something deeper calling you to lend a hand. It may be God saying, "I want to use you in this situation." When compassion is genuine, it is not driven by superficial pity. It is almost a force that pushes you to act, even if you don't know the person involved deeply. This stance of empathy and service is something that reflects divine character. Maybe you find yourself buying groceries for a stranger or giving time to someone who needs to vent, and then you realize that, on that very day, that person was calling for a sign of care. It's then evident that your gesture went far beyond a mere human act. Sign 14. Doors that open and doors that close. Amid so many choices, it may happen that some paths simply open up while others become almost impassable. At first, you get frustrated for not being able to do what you planned. But over time, you realize that the denied opportunity saved you from greater harm, or the granted opportunity led to valuable experiences. This movement of opening and closing is often driven by something unseen. It is God preventing you from entering complicated terrains or pushing you to move forward into areas where there is a promising future. And in this process, even frustrations can become signs. When everything comes to a halt, it might be time to turn around and seek another direction. When everything flows, it might be time to take more risks. Even so, it is not wise to use this as an immediate rule. You need to discern whether you are fleeing from a legitimate challenge or if it is truly a divine warning. What often makes the difference is the inner peace that accompanies the situation. If there is conviction even in difficulty, persist. If something inside you signals that it is time to stop, evaluate carefully. Sign 15. Guilt and regret that point to corrections. Guilt is often a feeling we repel, but it can be a great teacher when approached with sincerity. There are moments when, after a mistake or a harsh word, something weighs so heavily that you cannot disguise it. This might be God showing that it is time to make amends, to ask for forgiveness, or to realign your path. Regret is also not merely a negative emotion. It is like a warning signal that you have strayed and now realize you do not want to continue on that route. The discomfort it generates can lead to a reunion with yourself, where little by little you realign your heart with values that matter. This process, as painful as it may be, reveals that God has not given up speaking. He uses the discomfort to signal that there is hope for change. Sign 16. Peace that exceeds understanding. In a scenario of confusion and fear, it is strange to find peace. Still, it can happen that you feel a tranquility so out of context that it can only be explained by a higher intervention. When nothing is favorable and yet you remain at peace, it is possible that this is a sign that God is sustaining you in the midst of the storm. This kind of peace does not mean resigning or avoiding problems. It sustains the soul, even when everything around insists on saying that it will not work out. With this calm, you breathe, organize your thoughts, and move forward without being swallowed by the chaos. It's as if God were placing his hands on your shoulders and saying, "Stay firm." The curious thing is that this peace can also emerge as confirmation that you are on the right path. When you need to choose between two options and one of them brings peace, while the other generates internal turmoil, it's worth paying attention to this distinction. This feeling does not guarantee the absence of obstacles, but indicates that God is guiding you. Sign 17. Persistent discomfort that demands immediate action. In contrast to the previous sign, there are situations where you find no peace at all. A stubborn discomfort corrodes you from within, reminding you that something needs to be resolved, that a conversation must happen, or that a particular choice can no longer be postponed. This discomfort might be God silently shouting, demanding that you do something. Usually, this discomfort doesn't dissipate with distractions. You might even try to dive into entertainments to forget, but at the end of the day, the feeling reappears with the same intensity. It's as if you know that until you take a specific action, you will remain stuck with this restlessness. Therefore, do not fear facing this sign. It might be the push that was missing to unlock situations and generate a necessary change. Sign 18. Times of crisis that reveal new paths. Crises are uncomfortable, but they can also be fertile ground for profound revelations. When everything seems to be falling apart, you are more likely to seek answers that you would ignore in times of calm. It is in this state of vulnerability that often God becomes more evident, for you lower your defenses and allow yourself to see other possibilities. In a health crisis, for example, you may discover the fragility of life and come to value aspects that you previously overlooked. In a financial collapse, you may learn about humility and depend on a strength beyond your own efforts. In an emotional crisis, you are forced to face what you truly feel. In these scenarios, God can reframe situations, showing that there are doors that were previously hidden. Sign 19. Small external signs that insist on appearing. Sometimes, in the course of the hours, something seemingly trivial appears repeatedly, and you don't understand why. It could be a verse that is repeated in various conversations, a certain number that appears with curious frequency, a symbol that makes you think beyond. For some people, these details may indicate that God is trying to draw attention to a specific point. This type of sign is not a rule for everything, and caution is needed to avoid seeing signs in absolutely anything. However, if something has been repeating very evidently and your heart resonates with this fact, it might be the time to ask, God, what do you want to tell me with this? This internal dialogue can clarify a lot. Sign 20. Themes that repeat in conversations and readings. Imagine that you have been talking a lot about patience in recent days and, unintentionally, open a book that highlights the same subject. Soon after, you meet someone who decides to talk precisely about patience. This repetitive pattern could be a way for God to underline what he wants you to learn. In other words, he repeats the lesson until you understand. It's not a coincidence when several contents cross your path, emphasizing the same virtue or indicating the same correction. It is likely that God is showing, pay attention, I need you to grow in this point. Maid. So if you notice that you always stumble upon the issue of forgiveness, kindness, or self-control, for example, this might be the divine focus for your development. Sign 21. Deep convictions that leave no room for doubt. Some certainties do not arise from logical argument or external encouragement. They sprout from within in a way that, even if everything around contests, you remain firm. This can be a sign that God has established that conviction in your heart. It is not a matter of stubbornness or pride, but of an unshakable faith that relies on something greater than itself. When you receive this kind of conviction, it's hard to explain. You just know it's true, as if an internal seal had validated the issue. Many accounts state that in this state, difficulties don't disappear, but the person walks with no intention of giving up. It's the kind of faith that stands firm, even when the storm is intense. Sign 22. Clear directions in devotionals or moments of meditation. Some people set aside a moment of the day to study the Bible or write reflections in a kind of journal. During these pauses, you may be surprised by the clarity of certain directions that arise in your mind. It may feel like that text was written specifically for your current condition, or that the prayer reveals a fundamental insight. If you cultivate this devotional habit, don't be surprised if on certain days the words jump off the page as something alive. This is part of the way God interacts when He is given room. And you notice that it is not just your personal interpretation. There is a supernatural coherence that makes you realize there is another voice conversing with you through that text. Sign 23. Deepening in Bible reading that reveals personal secrets. In addition to exact moment verses, there is systematic reading of the Bible which, day by day, confronts, comforts, and teaches. You might pick a passage that you have read many times, but on a certain day, it resonates differently, almost like it's a new chapter for your life. This happens because the Bible is not a static book, and God uses it to speak in different situations and times. These personal secrets are not revealed in a search for empty mysticism, but in a predisposition to learn. When you read, you're not just exercising the mind, you are making room for the author of the Word himself to illuminate dark areas. Sometimes a verse comes up that directly attacks a weakness of yours, and you realize you can no longer pretend you didn't notice. Other times, it arrives as such a great relief that it makes you cry with gratitude. Sign 24. Sublime confirmations amid doubts. Even if you strive to hear God's voice, doubts can appear. And in those moments, He can send confirmations in a subtle, almost delicate way, but which make perfect sense to you. It might be a gesture from someone who knows nothing about your dilemma, but says or does something that perfectly matches what you needed to confirm. These confirmations act as anchors that stabilize your heart, bringing back the confidence that you are not alone. They can be repeated over a period until you gather the courage to take the step you have been so reluctant to take. And when you finally follow that direction, you realize that your anxiety decreases because this sensation of being on the right path is very strong. Sign 25. Intense personal experiences that change the course. The journey of each individual is marked by moments that go beyond the ordinary. These may include unexpected encounters, almost miraculous deliverances, or epiphanies that signify a before and after. Often, these events are used by God to completely redirect paths. It's when you say, "After that day, I was never the same." Some people go through scares that almost take their lives, but awaken to a spiritual reality they had ignored. Others endure deep losses and discover an inner strength they didn't know existed. There are also those who have defining encounters, whether in religious conferences or in solitary moments of reflection that turn their belief system upside down. In all cases, there is a clear message. God is not distant. He manifests in such a tangible way that it is impossible to remain the same. How to bring all this together? Perhaps at this point you see that there are various ways to perceive the voice of God. The challenge is to keep the heart open and the mind attentive. It is not about living life hunting for signs at every corner, but about developing a sensitivity that is built through a continuous relationship. When you draw closer to him, the pieces of the puzzle start to fit without much force, and what seemed disconnected begins to form a clearer picture. The already mentioned signs, awareness, creativity, mental alerts, revelation, aligned desires, spiritual stimulus, timely verses, dreams, circumstances, people, songs, silence, compassion, open and closed doors, repentance, peace, discomfort, crisis, small external signs, repetition of themes, convictions, directions in devotionals, deepening in the Bible, confirmations, and significant experiences are merely possibilities. You may find others, or conversely, you may find that some of these don't make much sense to your reality at the moment. The most important thing is not to close yourself off. If a spark appears that brings comfort or direction, consider the chance that it is God actively participating in your life. If you feel an enormous weight telling you not to do something, seriously ponder if it is a warning. And if peace arises amidst chaos, don't ignore it. God takes pleasure in communicating. He is neither indifferent to our routine nor insensitive to our internal battles. What to do now? Review your own history. See in what situations God might have spoken, and you, without realizing it, let it pass. Perhaps by rereading this list of signs, you will remember old episodes. And when that happens, you realize that there were moments when a brilliant idea appeared out of nowhere, or when a dream bothered you to the point of altering decisions, or when a friend came with a word that struck deeply. All of this is part of a puzzle that little by little forms a coherent picture. Allow yourself to experience this more consciously from now on. Set aside time to reflect, pray, or simply be silent and observe. Leave haste aside at some moments of the day. When you hear a song that moves you, question if there is something to be learned there. If someone appears with an improbable piece of advice, question if it's not God answering a doubt you have carried for days. If a biblical passage resurfaces repeatedly, question if you are avoiding a lesson that God insists on teaching. The issue, in the end, is not to prove that all these signs are entirely unquestionable. It is to admit that many times they accumulate in such a way that it is difficult to remain skeptical. There is something beyond our control, a presence that cares, advises, and watches, hoping we get where we are supposed to go. Some call it providence, others grace, but the name matters little when you feel that this care is real. And it is at this point that the questions return. Do you want to continue ignoring that voice that longs to guide you, or will you choose to listen? Are you willing to set aside your resistances and embrace the possibility that there is indeed a God who speaks today, not just in ancient texts? The decision is entirely yours. You can keep everything at the rational level, saying it doesn't make sense. Or you can open a crack for the inexplicable, realizing that there is much more than meets the eye in a superficial analysis. Life goes on, full of nuances, ups and downs. And in each of these curves, God can manifest in different ways, repeating signs, changing methods, but always making it clear that He has not forgotten you. Neither pain, nor confusion, nor human failures make Him give up trying to speak. Perhaps, along your journey, these signs will start to appear more intensely, creating a mosaic that, when you look back, will make complete sense. So far, we have not talked about absolute certainties, but about perceptions that point to a reality greater than our circumstances. If your heart has been moved during these explanations, stay attentive, as this may be the beginning of a transformation you never imagined could happen. Walking with God is not just about experiencing religious rituals or repeating memorized phrases. It is discerning in daily life those gentle or sometimes intense touches coming from a creator who never tires of calling his children. Therefore, before closing this point of conversation, it's worth personal reflection. Which of these signs has been appearing most frequently in your life? Is there something you've been ignoring but now makes more sense? What next step are you reluctant to take, even feeling that internal inclination, that insistence in your chest? And most importantly, how do you deal with the idea that there is a higher will interested in your well-being and your story? If you want, share in the comments. Your story can inspire those who are undecided or full of questions. It's amazing how a simple exchange of testimonies can light the way for someone seeking answers. Do not underestimate how much your personal experience, no matter how ordinary it may seem, can encourage someone who is in the exact same spot that you have already overcome. Additionally, if you haven't done so yet, leave your like and subscribe to continue following this content. After all, each gesture helps to spread messages that could be the spark someone needs in their life. You never know who is on the verge of losing hope and needs to read a specific line to find strength. Finally, we do not need immutable rules to hear the voice of God, but rather a heart willing to learn, eyes that do not shut to the unpredictable. So proceed, walk attentively, and allow each new dawn to be a chance to notice, even through the cracks of the day, that God keeps speaking, caring, warning, revealing, and guiding. It is not about perfection nor fanaticism. It is about recognizing that above human flaws and limitations, there is a love that does not run out and insists on communicating. It can be in a verse that explodes in your mind, in a dream that guides you, in a friend who says what you needed to hear, in an insight that springs out of nowhere, in a strange peace that confronts chaos, or even in an inner discomfort that demands change. Perhaps you're wondering how all this unfolds in practice during ordinary days. You might feel overwhelmed by the sheer number of signs and possibilities, not knowing where to begin to pay attention. It's normal to react this way when something shakes our understanding of what we thought we knew. Most of the time, we spend so long following routines, responding to pressures, and trying to survive that we neglect the sensitivity to see what lies beyond the obvious. So how do we make this dialogue with God tangible? How do we avoid going to extremes, but also not remain blind to the many signs that He communicates? The initial key is to change how we approach our day. Typically, our mind awakens with a massive list of tasks and concerns, leaving little room for deeper reflection. However, if we start by dedicating a few minutes to prayer or a moment of silence, we create a more conducive environment to feel what moves internally. For example, you can read a short passage from the Bible without haste and let the words resonate. It's not about deciphering everything. It's simply about opening gaps for something new to present itself. Another way to cultivate this sensitivity is by practicing gratitude. Sometimes we're so immersed in our lacks, what irritates us, or what went wrong, that we fail to notice the small manifestations of divine care. Therefore, before you sleep, try to briefly list what went right that day. It doesn't matter if they seem like minor victories, such as arriving safely at work or receiving an unexpected smile from someone. When we open ourselves to gratitude, we shift our focus from scarcity to abundance, making us more inclined to notice new signs. Of course, amidst this process, there is the risk of thinking that everything is a sign from God. That's where balance comes in. There is a difference between finding meaning in something that truly speaks to our heart and forcing explanations for every event, as if every breeze were an ultra-specific message from heaven. God is not a confusing generator of random signs. He does communicate, but in a way that brings transformation and maturity, not confusion and chaos. When true divine communication occurs, It is usually accompanied by peace or clarity that, even if uncomfortable, points towards a direction of growth. To help filter whether a sign is genuine or not, consider if what you perceive aligns with basic biblical teachings. God will not give you a sign to practice something that goes against his loving and just character. So if you notice something that incites you to hatred, cruelty, or dishonesty, you can be sure it does not come from God. This discernment is essential so that we do not fall into the error of justifying wrong attitudes using a false divine order. Another useful criterion is external confirmation. If a particular point repeatedly arises, be it in conversations, messages that appear frequently, or a constant peace that remains unshaken, it is more likely to be a divine guidance. Therefore, do not fear seeking counsel from mature people in faith, who can listen to what you perceive and provide honest feedback. Often these people serve as instruments to alert us if we are interpreting something wrongly, or to strengthen our conviction if we are truly receiving direction from God. Maybe you remember a phase when you felt stuck with no way out. However, it only took a sequence of events for everything to suddenly fall into place. Looking back, you conclude that if you had continued on the old path, you would have gotten into bigger trouble. But in the heat of the moment, you didn't have that much clarity. You only realized the divine care in retrospect once the danger had passed. This is quite common. God doesn't always need to explain in detail what he is doing. He simply acts, and it is up to us to choose whether we want to see and be grateful, or blame luck or destiny. It is also possible that you have experienced that impasse where everything seemed extremely difficult, almost unbearable, yet deep down there was a voice saying, "Keep going, don't give up." Against all logic, you found the strength to continue, and later you confirmed that this resistance was decisive. It's as if God blew courage into a heart that was already thinking about giving up. No one in your family or circle of friends understood where such persistence came from. In fact, it was a divine act responding to your cry, even if it was a silent prayer. On the other hand, there are situations that generate so much anguish that even praying becomes difficult. You feel blocked, immersed in solitude. It's in these moments that a praise, a song, a verse, or even a simple text sent by someone can break that shell of apathy. Suddenly the message makes sense, rekindles a spark of faith. If you are willing to receive it, you may feel something move within you, even if just for a moment. Usually, this is the initial impulse to get out of the hole. God works with progressive touches, never overruling our free will, but insisting just enough so that we know the door remains open. Certainly there are moments when God's response does not come in the way we would like. Perhaps you cried out for a specific change, but everything remained the same. Then you concluded that he did not respond. However, it might be that he said no or not now, and that contrary answer, instead of an immediate permission, is precisely the best demonstration of care. How many times, months or years later, do you thank for that door remaining closed? This discernment, however, only flourishes when we agree to revisit the facts with a humble heart, ready to recognize that we do not always know what is best for us. An important point. The way God speaks to you may not be the same way he uses for another person. Some people are very sensitive to nature. A majestically colored sunset brings forth deep feelings of reverence that remind them of God's presence. For others, answers arise while they are studying, reading, and reflecting more rationally. And some find that connection through art, whether it be music, painting, or any form of creative expression. The point is not to standardize the channel, but to realize that he adapts to our identity, our gifts, and our way of absorbing the world. This personal care becomes even more evident when you delve into your own story. How many circumstances were involved for you to be here today, reading or hearing these words? How many invisible protections happened? How many people crossed your path, contributed advice, resources, or just a friendly presence during tough times? It's possible that God used each of these pieces to form something that without Him would not be possible. Therefore, do not fall into the mistake of believing that He only speaks in an audible voice from the sky. Most of the time, He reveals Himself in the simple, the ordinary, in what seems unimportant. There will always be those who try to invalidate this type of perspective. They will say it is naive, that it is merely a matter of subjective interpretation. And in a way, yes, part of it is subjective, because it involves our faith and the willingness to believe in a reality that cannot be proven with equations alone. However, if you look closely, you will see that, throughout history, countless people have experienced something similar, individuals who transformed their way of living because they felt touched by this divine presence. These experiences recur in different eras, cultures, and contexts, confirming that there is indeed a constancy in this way of God relating to humanity. For those who ask, but why doesn't God show Himself clearly to everyone? It is worth remembering that part of His objective is for us to seek Him, get involved, and develop the ability to see beyond the obvious. If He presented Himself openly at every moment, there might not be room for freedom of choice or for the development of genuine faith. So, He reveals Himself sufficiently for those who desire to find Him to have solid clues, but not to the extent that it nullifies the desire of those who, for personal reasons, prefer not to believe. This balance between clarity and mystery permeates the entire human journey. It is possible that upon noticing these signs, you feel compelled to take an additional step. Maybe your religion is merely a family tradition, or something you do mechanically, without deep involvement. But now, after realizing that God communicates beyond the walls of a temple, you may start to seek a more vibrant, more sincere relationship. This could include getting involved in study groups, praying more consistently, reading the Bible with a new perspective, or practicing acts of solidarity without expecting anything in return. The relationship solidifies in action, and the voice of God becomes clearer when you begin to walk in the right direction. On the other hand, there are those who experience this calling even more intensely. In some cases, the person feels the need to completely reorient their professional, relational, or even geographical life. These changes are not taken lightly. They are often accompanied by strong conviction and many times by confirmations that leave no room for doubt. If you find yourself in this situation, perhaps with an almost uncontrollable urge to move to a different city, dedicate yourself to a missionary project, or start social work, seek counsel, pray a lot, and see if there are converging signs. When God sends such profound signals, He usually also provides the circumstances that make the transition possible. It is important to understand that each individual has their own pace. Perhaps you do not yet feel ready for something so radical. That's okay. God knows your limitations and does not push anyone beyond what they can bear. The essential thing is not to pretend that nothing is happening when, in fact, something inside you is pulsing for changes. After all, repeatedly ignoring this longing can lead to a state of inertia, where sensitivity diminishes and you start living on autopilot, losing the freshness that communion with God could bring. Many people discover, by cultivating this relationship, that life takes on a different tone. Problems do not evaporate, but you feel stronger to deal with them. Doubts do not disappear, but hopelessness no longer dominates as before. It is like being anchored to something greater than your own emotions. And as you open yourself to perceive the signs and respond to them, an intimate connection emerges that nourishes your spirit. It is different from following a list of religious rules because it involves the awareness that God is not a distant spectator, but a companion present in every detail of the journey. It is very likely that, in the midst of these reflections, you recall certain times when you felt an opportunity slipping away because of insecurity or fear. Perhaps God was showing you something, but your lack of faith prevented you from embracing it. The good news is that not all is lost. As long as you have life, you can resume the dialogue, ask for forgiveness for moments of doubt, and move forward with a different attitude. God never tires of granting new chances to those who genuinely wish to start over. This does not mean ignoring the consequences of what was done or left undone, but opening yourself to the restoration that only He can give. Many of these opportunities to start over arise precisely when we encounter new signs that seem to say, "Hey, there is still time to correct the course." Perhaps you are about to give up on a dream that God Himself placed in your heart, and then you receive an unexpected encouragement that reignites your motivation. Or you may be in a troubled relationship and suddenly come across an overcoming story that makes you rethink your attitudes. If you keep your sensitivity sharp, you will realize that the universe of signs is as vast as the divine capacity to show that He cares. It is worth remembering that divine signs are not necessarily promises of an easy life. Receiving them does not guarantee that everything will flow without setbacks. In fact, if you study the Bible, you will see that many characters were led by clear signs and messages from God and still faced enormous trials. But in each obstacle, there was this inner certainty that God remained in control. This perspective has to do with trusting beyond logic and, at the same time, not falling into naive triumphalism. It is the conviction that even if the path is arduous, He will guide the steps of those who seek Him. Sometimes the sign is exactly the alert that something will be tough, but it's worth moving forward. God does not deceive anyone with empty promises. When He gives a flash of light, it is to strengthen us to the point of crossing the storm if necessary, and upon coming out the other side, matured faith is what remains. Thus, each sign we see or hear becomes a cornerstone in our inner construction, making us more resilient, compassionate, and aware. And how to know if, in a moment of deep pain, God is really speaking? The reality is that pain often creates internal noise that prevents us from hearing anything. But with time and with the practice of opening oneself to a comfort that comes beyond human explanations, it is possible to notice signs of comfort and hope budding amidst tears. God manifests in the embrace of someone who stands by your side without saying a word, in a message that arrives unexpectedly, in a Bible passage that soothes the suffering. You might not want any of this at that moment, but as you embrace it, you realize that divine grace is indeed present. All these forms of communication show that there are no limits to God's creativity. He can use chaos to make us stop and reflect, can use a child to say words that no adult would dare to say, can use an email, a street sign, a movie, or even something seemingly insignificant. However, if you are very closed off, complaining and insisting that there is no answer, you will hardly be able to see any trace of divine revelation. For this reason, the invitation remains for you to cultivate humility and the recognition that, alone, you do not have all the answers. This humility creates room to receive, while arrogance locks doors and keeps you trapped in a bubble of self-sufficiency. After all, any sign would require a measure of faith to be accepted as such. And faith is not just emotion. It is the decision to believe that there is a God and that He cares enough to interact with His creatures. It is letting go of an illusory control that we think we have over everything. Throughout this message, we unfold various facets of how God communicates. We have seen timely verses, dreams, warnings, moral conscience, an inner voice, people used as instruments, signs in creation, remembrances of promises, feelings of peace and comfort in chaotic moments, repetition of themes, crises that push us to reflection, the presence of repentance that shapes character, the emergence of open or closed doors, among so many other forms. All this makes up a vast repertoire. So if one path did not work with you, it may very well be that God uses another. And when you persist in walking in this direction, the perception that God speaks is not limited to isolated episodes. It becomes a lifestyle. You wake up with the awareness that at any second a sign can appear. And this sign can radically change the way you face the day. You get used to presenting your dilemmas in prayer, no longer as an anxious monologue, but as a conversation in which you indeed expect an answer, knowing that it can come in unexpected ways. And when it comes, you learn to value it, to be grateful, and to put it into practice, instead of leaving it in the drawer of forgetfulness. It is also worth noting that signs are not meant to turn us into experience hunters. The center of everything is the personal relationship with God, not a frantic search for extraordinary phenomena. When the relationship is healthy, the signs fit naturally, and your life is organized around clearer purposes. When only sensations or novelties are sought, there is a risk of falling into deception or becoming obsessed with wonders, losing the essence of genuine communion. If we stop to consider, this dynamic invites us to a fuller life because it stops being lived on the surface of events. We begin to dig for meaning in the details, to cultivate goodness in ourselves and others, to listen more attentively to what people say. After all, who knows if that seemingly casual conversation doesn't hide a message that God wants to give us? Who knows if the silence of a sunset with the sun setting doesn't bring a serenity that reminds us that there is a conductor behind it all? By adopting this stance, you do not alienate yourself from the real world. On the contrary, you engage in it with an expanded dimension, free from a suffocating materialism and at the same time anchored in something more solid than volatile opinions. It is also important to remain vigilant to avoid labeling everything as God spoke. Sometimes we may only have our own projections or desires. This is a delicate point because when we mix God's voice with our needs, there is room for confusion and even manipulation. Therefore, the search for coherence with biblical principles and dialogue with trusted people become pillars of security. If something contradicts the loving and just essence of God, then it should not come from Him. If a seemingly inspired decision brutally harms those around, it is likely not aligned with divine will. In everything, balance and maturity are fundamental. We can still think about the dynamics of time. In the heat of the moment, we might not understand why certain interventions or signs occur. Then, frustration or confusion takes over. However, as we mature, we look back and realize that it was indeed the best direction. God sees beyond what we perceive in the present, and that is why many signs only become fully clear in hindsight. This does not mean you shouldn't act when you feel guided. It means that patience is an ally when understanding doesn't come immediately. Each experience shared by people of faith who have gone through emotional, family, financial, or existential crises confirms that, as contradictory as it may seem, there is a purpose amidst the trials. And in these dark valleys, signs tend to shine brighter, not because God wants to test us like a ruthless teacher, but because He knows that pain makes us more receptive, attentive, and sincere in our search for help. In these moments of vulnerability, He speaks even more clearly as we set aside our rational barriers. In the mountaintops, when everything is going well, there is a danger of self-sufficiency. During these periods, it's easy to think we don't need anyone and that we achieve everything on our own. Unfortunately, this can diminish our capacity to listen. So, if you find yourself in a moment of success or prosperity, be twice as careful to maintain humility and an open heart. Remember that signs are not only useful when things are going badly. Even in good times, God wants to keep talking, guiding, correcting, and celebrating with us so that we don't get lost in vanity or selfishness. Given all of this, it becomes clear that the journey of listening to God is continuous, not an isolated event. You take the first steps, begin to recognize certain signs, learn to trust more. But this does not mean that you will know everything or that you will not make mistakes. There will be periods when you feel distant, not picking up on anything. In these desert intervals, faith is tested. There will also be moments when communications arise in abundance, almost overwhelming your logic and transforming your perception of reality. The essential thing is to maintain the commitment to continue, as each phase has something to teach. Some might ask, and where does love for others fit into all of this? The answer is simple. The most concrete way to prove that you are in tune with God and hearing His voice is the practical result of this in your relationships. The Bible says that those who do not love their neighbor cannot love God, for He is love. So if we say we receive divine signs but continue to act with cruelty, injustice, or intolerance, something is out of alignment. God's voice, when properly heard, pushes us into service, forgiveness, empathy, and compassion. There is no way to cultivate a deep relationship with Him without it overflowing into concrete acts of care toward those around us. Everything that is being said here converges on the realization that God respects human freedom but does not cease to interact. He is in the ordinary of life, in the quick visits we receive, in the sincere messages that friends give us, in the invitations that come out of nowhere, in the things we read or hear. If you decide to open your eyes to recognize, you will see that these touches of God are scattered throughout the journey. If you choose to close your eyes, you will find excuses for everything, attributing everything to chance, and that's just how it is. However, by remaining aware of the possibility that He wants to have a relationship with you, each day will become filled with opportunities to perceive something new and edifying. In this sense, it's not necessary to create a foolproof guide on how to listen to God, but rather to adopt an attitude of readiness. When there is readiness, you live as if to say, I am here, willing to accept what I perceive to be from Him, even if I don't fully understand. This is what some call obedience, but not blind and baseless obedience, rather an obedience born from the understanding that God is good, and His intentions are of peace, growth, and love. Thus, even if He asks for something difficult, there is trust that in the end it will result in good. Walking with Him does not remove suffering, but it gives meaning to each stage. Life ceases to be a succession of meaningless days and begins to unfold like a story, which even with dramatic chapters points to a higher outcome. And in this story, the signs function like road signs, indicating where to go, where to rest, when to be careful, or when to accelerate. Each step increases your intimacy with the author of this narrative. The fascinating thing is that upon realizing He communicates, you also feel free to speak with Him frankly. And prayer, then, ceases to be a religious protocol and becomes a genuine dialogue. You express your complaints, longings, gratitude, perplexities. And from time to time, you will see a response that is not limited to a simple, "Okay, I heard you," but something that indeed affects your reality. It could be immediate consolation in the heart, a precise verse, a person with an encouraging word, or even a change in circumstances. Therefore, communication is not just Him throwing out signs and you running to interpret them. It becomes a reciprocal, living relationship. And the more you feed off this relationship, the more naturally you perceive the signs, as your mind gets used to operating in a listening pattern. It's almost like learning another language. In the beginning, everything seems confusing, but with practice you start to understand without much effort. And before you know it, you're conversing fluidly. Similarly, with God, after a while, you don't need to sweat to decipher every clue. You recognize the voice because of your familiarity. This learning can be so profound that if someone questions you, you might not know how to prove it with logical arguments, but you will have full inner conviction. You will say, "I know it's real because I have experienced it," and no one can take away the power of a genuine experience. Circumstantial evidence may vary, but what is engraved in the soul remains. It is this type of certainty that has sustained people worldwide throughout the centuries, across all social levels, languages, and cultures. Because God's voice is universal, but also personal. It speaks everywhere, but addresses each heart uniquely. In light of all this, the reminder remains that the signs do not exist for us to feel special or privileged, but so that we do not walk in darkness. God does not intend for us to grope aimlessly, always stumbling over the same stones. He cares enough to illuminate the path. The question is, you, holding the lamp in your hand, will you prefer to keep it off, or will you allow this beam of light to reveal the way? Throughout the previous lines, we have repeatedly emphasized the choice everyone has to make. This is not religious rhetoric, but a practical reality. If you persist in neglecting divine touches, you will gradually dull your sensitivity. Conversely, if you remain open, you might be surprised at how much your life gains meaning. Not everything will be easy, but there will be an underlying purpose, a source of courage and hope. As we have said before, God does not pressure those who do not want to be pressured. However, he knocks on the door until one day you either open it or pretend not to hear. In fact, there are people who only recognize the value of this presence when things become really complicated and there is nowhere else to turn. In those moments, some discover that the voice they once ignored was there, ready to offer direction or comfort. And even then, God does not reject them. He remains available because his love does not wear out like human love. And in an extraordinary turn of events, many find, amidst tragedy, the most beautiful confirmation that God has always been nearby, although not seen. Whatever your situation, remember, the signs exist, but the decision to see them and respond to them is yours. Every morning you can ask for sensitivity so as not to miss what the Creator is trying to communicate. And at night, when you lay your head on the pillow, you can review the day's events, identifying where he appeared and how you reacted. This type of daily practice, although simple, will build in you a sense of connection that will gradually transform the way you face each challenge. And if you want to go further, share with others what you have realized. Tell friends or relatives how something you thought was impossible became possible, thanks to an intervention you recognize as divine. Talk about the verse that suddenly illuminated your confusion. Explain how a disturbing dream prevented you from making a tragic decision. When you share these experiences, you not only solidify them in your own memory, but also inspire those who listen, allowing them to reflect on their own experiences. It is wonderful to see that, when this sharing spreads, it creates a network of testimonies that strengthen collective faith. Suddenly, someone who didn't realize it before starts to perceive that they also received signs but ignored them. And from this recognition, they become more willing to pay attention. Thus, the fruits multiply, generating more love, care, empathy, and transformation of lives. Perhaps that is precisely why you are here at this moment, reading these words. Not by coincidence, but by an alignment of factors that God used to get your attention. You might need this reminder not to succumb to disbelief, to regain hope, or to take a significant step toward a greater purpose. And, if that is the case, do not let this opportunity slip through your fingers. Respond actively, for those who seek shall find, and those who knock shall have the door opened. Thus, following this path, you expand your repertoire of how God communicates, not just by memorizing theories, but by experiencing them in practice. The day will come when, looking back, you will see a trail of evidence marking each stage of your journey. And when someone asks how you know that God speaks, you will be able to say, "Because he spoke to me in ways I cannot deny, shaping the person I am today." Now, at this point, you might be considering the next step. Perhaps it's to intensify prayer, begin a more systematic Bible study, seek someone to talk to about these discoveries, or even engage in community service that puts into action what's been awakened. Every sincere step of obedience usually opens doors to more signs, more growth, and more certainties. There's no reason to remain stagnant. With God, movement is constant, even if subtle. If there are fears, present them. If there are doubts, verbalize them. God is not intimidated by our weaknesses. He knows them better than we do. In fact, facing fragility with honesty can be the trigger for him to show his strength. In weakness, dependence grows, and the door opens to the supernatural. It is contradictory to the world's standards, but it makes total sense in the context of a God who always perfects his power amid human limitations. Thus, the decision remains in your hands. You can continue living life the same way, attributing everything to chance, coincidence, or luck. Or you can allow yourself to taste the flavor of walking with God and notice his daily manifestations. If you choose the latter option, you will discover there are dimensions of peace, love, courage, and discernment that completely transform the way of being in the world. It is not an escape from reality. It is a deeper immersion in reality, one that includes the divine touch in all aspects of life. And from now on, as you process everything that has been presented, each breath you take can be a reminder that life is not a random assortment of events. There is intention, a story being written, and whether in the gaze of a child or the words of an elder, there are traces of this greater narrative. When you leave your house, the scenery may look the same, but if you are awake to what God is doing, you will notice signs that previously escaped you. The possibilities are endless because he is not limited to predetermined techniques. And let this not be just another text you read and put away without action. Let it serve as inspiration to effectively change the way you relate to the sacred. A simple attitude of, "I will be more attentive," can unlock insights that seemed locked away. For example, how about at the end of this day asking yourself, "What signs did I receive today?" and not immediately notice? You might be surprised to realize how many of them were there, waiting to be recognized. As you proceed, remember that people around you are also thirsty for this contact. They might be trapped in pain, loneliness, or distrust. If you have now been awakened to these signs, why not be a channel of hope for them? Offer a word of support, or share what touches you. Sometimes God speaks to them precisely through your gesture. This is how his love spreads in a network, creating a chain of light amidst the darkness. Finally, remain firm in the certainty that God does not give up. Even if you get distracted and stumble, he appears again. Even if you rebel for a time, he continues knocking, waiting for your return. In this dynamic, divine communication does not cease because God himself is the word that generates life. And as long as there is breath in your lungs, there will always be a chance to recognize him, to align yourself with the plans he has drawn, and to participate in something greater than yourself. You now realize that God is not just a distant idea. He keeps sending signs that you often hesitate to see. Your conscience, your hunches, your emotions, all could be forms of care and direction. What if, instead of ignoring them, you take the risk of welcoming each hint? You might find a meaning you didn't expect, a peace that seemed impossible, or a new direction that no one around you could imagine. So, I want to invite you to act. Subscribe to this channel now. Leave your like, and in the comments, talk about the moment when you realized that God was trying to communicate with you. Share something that transformed your view. It may be simple, but it's powerful for those who need to find signs of hope. You are not alone.